Um, I suppose that parable is as good a place to start as any. In staging it, if one were to do a full production, you would have a narrator. The narrator, you heard some of his text, is Husamuddin Chelebi. Rumi could not write without directing his words towards a spiritual beloved. And now I'm not talking about, something abstract and on high. He had to make it concrete. It had to be someone in front of him. So Rumi, before Husamuddin Chelebi, recorded all 6 books of the Masnavi, which were recited spontaneously over a decade in 22-syllable rhyming couplets. They weren't written by hand, they were done spontaneously. And Husamuddin wrote it down. They were directed to Husamuddin. And as you read the Masnavi, Rumi will frequently say, "Oh, Husamuddin, these words are coming from you." Because that was a connection. Of course, to us, that's absurd. The words were coming from Rumi, Husamuddin was writing them down. And this parable, in the version that we had set out in the touring version, Husamuddin narrated. We never put Rumi on stage. Husamuddin narrated the story because he was close to the text. So it would also be a seeker who's helping him to narrate from the Masnavi, someone being trained in Rumi's order, a young woman in this case called the seeker. We had a Bharatnatyam dancer in this scene who came in from a previous parable called The Hindus and the Elephant, which is the same as Buddha's parable about the elephant in the dark room, where people feel different parts of an elephant and they don't have the whole reality. Rumi begins, "Some Hindus have brought an elephant for sale." So they're in a dark room and everyone is feeling different parts of the elephant. But coming along with them is the Bharatnatyam dancer. So she becomes, in the spirit of the universal understanding of religions that Rumi had, she becomes part of the parable of Moses and the shepherd. So she dances in Bharatnatyam style, taking care of the divine in the form of, let's say, the baby Krishna. Devotional religion, not mystical religion, not reaching out to Brahman or to the formless divinity that is important to mystics the world over, but to something specific. Moses condemns us. You can't put shoes and socks on the sun. What are you doing? So the Bharatnatyam dancer is dancing this, and the seeker is narrating it, and Husamuddin takes all the words of Moses. That's the way it would be staged if you had everything. Moses gets this message. I'm doing a little bit of a recap here, I realize, but it might be worthwhile. Moses, after telling off this shepherd for his devotional religion, gets the word, "You have divided one of mine from me. This is not what it's about." So Moses goes running through the desert. If you can imagine, the Bharatnatyam dancer really contributes to this idea of traveling through the desert and dancing her way uphill, down dale, through the valleys, and so on, till Moses comes to the shepherd again and says, "I am sorry. You have the true faith. You are devoted. Nothing is better than the love you have shown." Not the end of the story. Then the shepherd says, "No, Moses, you plied the lash. You taught me, and I leapt past the lotus tree to the 7th heaven. And now my divine nature is one with my human nature." Typical of Rumi, there is not one moral to this story. There's a reversal. And in doing this, this is experiential. When Rumi tells a parable, he wants to crack us open, our sense of logic. He doesn't want us to be unreasonable people, but he wants to crack open our, let's say, our simple moralistic sense of religion and let it grow into something greater. So everything in Rumi is experiential. I was just speaking to someone about the Sema dance, the Sema ritual, the whirling. Yeah? It's a practice that was formalized in his order, the Mevlevi order, with music. Sema is an experiential Sufi practice of listening to music. You can meditate in sobriety, that means pure meditation, nothing's going on, you're empty, you're still. Or with ecstasis, where you rise and you just leap out of yourself. And that's what the Central Asian turning dance was. It was formalized by the Mevlevis, and it's experiential. It's the idea of turning, concentrating on your axis, as I was just discussing it with one person here, one leg, and you turn on that one axis, and you open yourself to receiving from above and giving to below. And you have to stay aware, because if you're spinning, if you don't stay aware, you're down. So inner and outer, both, not one. You see, this is what Rumi emphasizes. It's not one or the other. It's all. And it's sometimes things that contradict each other. So the devoted shepherd worships God through very loving devotion in a very almost earthly way. But in the end, Moses somehow gave him a lesson that allowed him to break free, the veils fall away, and he has a transcendent experience. Rumi does not give one moral to each story. These are not like Aesop's fables, where the fox, what is the moral? The fox tries to get the grapes. Does anyone remember the moral for that? I don't remember much Aesop.
He couldn't get the grapes, so he said there's sour grapes.
So he said there's sour grapes, you see, and that's how people are when they don't get what they want. And that's the moral to the story. Rumi's parables are not like that. Meditation is experiential. It arises from the world's great religions, but it's an experiential form. So it's not so much talking about does one believe in God, it's what does one experience. And it also has to do with the breath, but we'll come back to that. Somebody asked me earlier, how did I get, I think it was the same person. Yes. Somebody asked me earlier, how did I come to this material, including this play on Nur Inayat Khan, who is the daughter of the first teacher to bring Sufism to the West. And Indian music, by the way. It was not Ravi Shankar. It was 50 years before that. They just didn't have a lot of recording industry then. I was interested in the wisdom traditions when I was quite young. I did Zazen, Zen Buddhism. I read a lot of the beat poets, are so important to American young literary people in the 60s and 70s and so on. But then I went to the other wisdom traditions, Vedanta, and eventually Sufism. And I made a pilgrimage to Konya, which is the city where Rumi settled when his family was in flight from Genghis Khan. Remember, we're talking about the 13th century. Konya in Turkey, which was the Seljuk capital. And there is his shrine. And they also commemorate there his urs, which is for a Sufi master. That is, we would say it's a commemoration of his death, but they never refer to it that way. Urs is a marriage with the other side. And we even visited his earlier companion, spiritual beloved, Shams al-Din. All of the great ghazals that you may have read by Rumi, the lyric poetry, not the parables of the Masnavi, were in some way dedicated to this teacher, spiritual friend, Shams al-Tabriz, to whom he was completely dedicated. He called Shams his only teacher. Shams called Rumi his teacher. Actually, neither of them could have found teachers anywhere else. They were at a pretty high level. And unfortunately, Shams, there was a lot of envy, even among Sufi students. And Shams fled to Damascus, but then Sultan Balad, Rumi's son, went all the way to Damascus, tracked him down, found him, brought him back, because Rumi was grieving so much. He was grieving so much that he had written about 80,000 lines of lyric poetry. That's pretty serious. He brought him back, and then he stayed. But among Rumi's students, some of whom were students of religious law as well as other things other than Sufism, they didn't approve of this. They didn't, and they felt some kind of envy, perhaps. And there's evidence that Shams was somewhat threatened by this. In any case, one day there was a knock on the door. Shams answered it according to the tradition, and never reappeared again. And Rumi's grief continued. And the theme of separation dominated his work, because there's no greater theme for showing how powerful love is. So we might say, oh, it's great to write to the beloved and praise the beloved, to praise Krishna, to speak of the love, to praise Layla as Majnun did, to speak the heart. However, when it comes to separation, then you really get to the power of love. But separation implies something else, which means this wish to get back to that which one loves. So this becomes part of the Sufi method of finding a way back. And in Rumi's case, the most famous lines open the Masnavi. Beshnu az ne chun hekoyat mikonad az jo daiha shekoyat mikonad. Listen to the sound of the ne, make its complaint, remembering its being severed from the riverbed. And it goes on to say, women and men have moaned for each other when they miss each other. And this is the nature of love. This is the nature of yearning. But it also says something else, that the reed flute that yearns to get back to the riverbed is it's a musical instrument. And through that instrument comes the breath of the flute player. This is a wonderful metaphor for meditation. We know it by different names in different traditions. In Sufism, it's muraqabah, meditation. It's the breath. They say Atman from Sanskrit actually became Atem, breath in German, which also means soul in German. In Scandinavian languages, it became Ond, which means breath and spirit. So what is inspiration? Inspiration is like the breath or the spirit coming in. Expiration is when it goes out. Respiration is when we breathe, but that word for spirit is there. So the flute, if it's well made, if it's in tune, will take the breath, will take the spirit. The flute will be played by the flute player. And Rumi says, Atashastin bangene on nistbad, harke inatash nadarad nistbad. It's fire in that flute and not wind. He who has that not is in non-existence. So this is why I have called the opening 16 lines of the Masnavi, and I'm not the only one who's done this, the kind of Heart Sutra, as in the Buddhist Heart Sutra, for the Sufis. It's all there. All 6 big books of the Masnavi are contained in those first 16 lines, and then he opens it up and he tells hundreds of parables, some of which come from the stories of Moses and the Old Testament and so on. A whole lot of them turn out to be taken from the Panchatantra in India. Some of them are Buddhist parables. Some of them are strikingly original. Some of them come from the Quran. So Rumi, all of this is to say, Rumi is the center from which this tradition called Sufism emanates. There's a difference, though. In other traditions, in Buddhism, we say Buddhism arises from Shakyamuni or Siddhartha Gautama, Buddha. But in the case of Sufism, there were many traditions that came together from pre-Islamic Middle East and from the early days of Islam to unite into this practice called tasawwuf, having to do with, it's a word that has to do with wool, perhaps the wool worn by ascetics. So, Rumi is like a vortex, and these different trends from Eastern mysticism, different trends from within Islam as well, pass through him and out again. And he is that way, he becomes the central figure of Sufism. It existed before him, long before. There are traditions that the Sufis have adopted that also have to do with the play that Onacht Arts is doing. Sound Waves, The Passion of Nur Inayat Khan. And I think I'll take a moment to talk about how that works. In pre-Islamic Persian Empire, one of the many practices besides the fire temple, which, by the way, has its echo in the early Aryan religions in India. The fire temple was one, chanting was another. Eventually, with Vedanta, we sacrifice the self, the ego. And we do good works. The ancient tradition in the Persian Empire was called by the Persians Javan Mardi. Translated to European terms, this would mean chivalry. It means service of the highest order. It means the spiritual practice of doing good and kindness for others. This was so much a practice that in the Persian Empire there were lodges And we know that Sufis are known for having lodges, although they don't use that word. Taqiyya is one, Hanukkah is another. But in these lodges gathered the Javan Mard, the people that practiced Javan Mardi. And they would go out and they would do the good works. Yes. And they would not ask thanks. They would do it for the purpose of serving God, serving the universe, of serving their fellow beings. Noor Inayat Khan was a daughter of a great master, Pir, in world Sufism. But she was a young girl. She was in her late teens when he went back to India knowing he was going to die. And he was buried at Hazrat Nizamuddin. He was affiliated with that order, Chishti order. And some people may know Hazrat Nizamuddin is one of the centers of Qawwali music, along with Ajmer, India. He is buried there. She was young. She could not have been a Sufi teacher at that point. She managed the household, and if you go to see the play, you'll hear about that. It was a center that her father set up in Suresnes, France, a place that Vinita apparently knows very well, by coincidence. And this household was called Fazl Manzal, House of Blessings. And she ran it. She may not have taught, but she ran the activities for the children, arts, music, culture, all tied into the spiritual mission of this place. I've spoken to some of you about the parallel between Inayat Khan's approach and that of Rabindranath Tagore, combining music and arts with a spiritual perspective. But when she signed up, when her adopted country of France was facing the Nazi invasion, contrary to a lot of things we hear today, such people can't be loyal to their new countries or loyal to some other place or religion or whatever, she decided to make her way to England along with her brother. And her decision was eventually to try to get into MI6. A Sufi. She was also a strong admirer of Gandhi and had some aspirations to get back to India to take part in that. Nope, she ended up going through training. MI6 was dissolved. It was expanded to form the SOE, the first worldwide global espionage, anti-fascist, anti-militarist organization that the Brits set up for that period. And she continued her work there. What is remarkable is how mindful she was. She went through brutal training, but she refused to accept her service pistol when she was dropped in France to work with the French resistance against the Nazis. Her only weapon, and she was a musician, trained musician, conservatory trained, was not a musical instrument in this case, but a 30-pound radio broadcasting device that went in a suitcase with a long, long cable, 50 feet, with which she would use very elaborate forms of code to communicate with London, she would communicate from the resistance to London, and they would communicate back. She had to know that the people, the coders, they called them pianists, interestingly. The average time that they lasted was 2 weeks before the Gestapo caught them, imprisoned them, killed them. She lasted 2 months. She was the last remaining coder working for the resistance in Paris. And then she, if you see the play, you'll see how she moves towards her end, which was in Dachau. And she's memorialized in Dachau. She's memorialized in Paris. There's a plaque. She's called Madeleine of the French Resistance. That was her code name. And in London, and I'm trying to think which park, it's in Gordon Park, where Rabindranath Tagore's statue is. A bust was unveiled to her by the royal family 4 years ago. And in the same park were Muslims, Hindus, Sufi Muslims, and all of the British security services. And I don't know, maybe a few hippies. I'm not quite sure, but it was packed. And you can see that bust there today. A book, Spy Princess, came out, which talks about her amazing courage in the anti-Nazi resistance. And I thought that book was brilliantly done. However, the first half was missing. Her Sufi upbringing. I just simply wanted to add on to what was very well organized facts in that book for a live performance. What was it like in Fazl Manzil? What were the teachings like? Why was music important? Why was she so mindful? And what was she doing? In talking to her nephew, Pirzia Inayat Khan, who's now the Pir, the head of the Inayati order, it's pretty clear, I discovered, that she was working in the spirit of the JoeMartin, the Persian tradition. It actually was absorbed into the Quran. It's called futuwah, chivalry. This is considered a high ideal. Chivalry, again, we have to be careful with that word. Don't think about knights in armor with big lances and swords. Chivalrous behavior is the behavior of giving, thinking of other beings first. It is a practice. She may not have been a great meditation master in her lifetime, but she was one of the greatest practitioners of futuwah. Well, that's actually a masculine word, and I don't know the feminine in Arabic, or JoeMartin. That's what her story to me is about. That is what we could use so much more of. So, I've talked about 2 works here, Rumi's Masnavi, which I did some work on, and then the story of Nur Inayat Khan, and how I was drawn to them. If you have some questions, maybe we should... Do I have the authority to open this up for questions? Okay. Yes.
So you were saying that Rumi had a lot of influences of Buddhist and Hindu influences? And how did that come at that time?
I'm glad you asked that. She was asking it. I was saying that he had a lot of Buddhist and Hindu influences. I would say indirectly. He didn't think like we might do today. The world wasn't as small as it is today. He wasn't thinking, let me take some Hinduism and let me go to the Buddha's teachings. It came to him. It just so happened that the Panchatantra was translated into Persian and was some kind of big medieval hit as a book. And it had another name. Some people didn't even know it came from India. But these stories spoke to him, so he used them. He does, according to the great translator Nicholson, who, by the way, did both the Persian and English editions of the Masnavi in the 20th century. He did have a term for Buddhism, which is not the typical term. So Buddha's parables somehow made their way to him. And what you'll see in the Sound Waves, The Passion of Nur Inayat Khan, is that one of her early books was her own adaptations of the Buddhist Jataka tales. Different lives of the Buddha in different forms and how he acts with compassion. So not directly.
Were they on a trade route or something like that?
Oh yeah, oh yes, Silk Road.
On the Silk Road.
Oh yes, oh yeah, the stories traveled up and down the Silk Road, the books, then come the translations. And so this is a very good point you make. And he absorbed stuff from the Silk Road, every bit as much as Yo-Yo Ma, who does all the Silk Road fusion music, right? So that's how it came to him. He was responding in a way that is universal among mystics, including in the Christian religions and Judaism, where the numbers were maybe smaller than they were in India or in Sufi regions of Islam, or in China with Taoism. Yeah. Yes?
He was born in Afghanistan. So how many years did he spend there, and what were the influences, religious influences, cultural influences, that he got from the place of his birth?
Yes.
I'm going to repeat the question.
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead. Yeah, it might be good.
Yeah. Sorry, you said in Afghanistan, what was his influence? He was born in Afghanistan.
I don't know how many years he remained as a child in Afghanistan. And I wanted to know what were the cultural influences in Afghanistan in the 12th century that would have permeated into his education.
Do you want to repeat that?
Okay, you go ahead and repeat it. Then I don't have to do this.
Or we could pass that mic around to people. Oh, no. No, it won't work.
Stand up and
No, it won't work. It's okay. Okay.
born in Afghanistan, and what were his childhood influences, in 12th century Afghanistan that may have had an effect in shaping who he became eventually?
It's very funny. The Turks say Rumi. They call him Mevlana. That's a Turkish pronunciation. Persian, it's Mevlana, right? And the Persians will say, oh, Mevlana? Who's that? You mean Mevlana? He's Persian. He's the greatest Persian poet. And the Turks will say, no, he lived most of his life in Turkey. And the Afghans will say, wait a minute, he was born in Balkh. He left as an adult. His real name is Rumi. His real name is Jalaluddin Balkhi, not Rumi, because Rum was Anatolia. It was Rome. So his name is Jalaluddin Balkhi. Everyone wants him. He left, I think, around age 18. And that was because of Genghis Khan's approach, and a lot of people were refugees.
What was the religious milieu in Afghanistan, and what influences did he absorb from that?
All of the Persian Empire, and most especially Khorasan, the northeast of Iran today still, and all of Afghanistan, was a very rich, deeply Sufi area at the time. And the language of Dari today in Afghanistan is actually the Persian Rumi wrote in. The thing with Farsi is that it has more Arabic loan words. So I speak only a little bit. So actually the Dari is more preserved. He was not a poet while he was there. He was a very, very good student history, Islamic jurisprudence, theology, but with a Sufi tinge. His father was a Sufi theologian and also expert in jurisprudence. And his father decided we need all to go. And so they fled all the way south by way of Damascus, and then they ended up in Turkey because the Seljuk, I think it was Kikobad, the Sultan, gave them a home there. But it was not until he was approaching middle age that this traveling dervish, a dervish, in India, they're often called fakirs because they practice spiritual poverty. But in the rest of the world, a dervish is what these devotees are called. And it means threshold, standing at the threshold. And a wandering dervish came to Konya. And Rumi was on horseback, and he saw this guy and immediately had a response to him. And there's variations on this story, as there always are from things from 1240, the year 1240, in which this wandering dervish, Shams al-Tabriz, which means the son of Tabriz, asked him, who is greater, the Prophet or Bayezid Bestami? Well, it's an impossible question because in terms of the religion, clearly the Prophet. But for Sufi, Bayezid Bestami was so possessed by the divine, so saturated with it, that he would say, glory be to me, how great is my force, or something like that, which is sacrilege according to most religions. But from a Sufi understanding, that meant he was totally God-saturated at that moment. He was at one with the divine realm. So among Sufis, he was considered the greatest. Bayezid, by the way, comes from the 9th century. Early Sufi master. Well, it was not a question Rumi could cope with, and he fell off his horse. So you see, he must have learned this technique of cracking open people's minds with questions like that. And after that, they went in a retreat together. They challenged each other. They meditated together. They sat in silence together. This really messed up his teaching schedule at the university. In those days, what was called a madrasa was really a glorious kind of school. Science, art, theology, philosophy, which is where he taught. This idea has been very degraded. But if you go to see the madrasa in Konya, it's amazing. It's like a planetarium, But he decided he was working on himself, and he'd found his teacher. And this is what caused some of that dissension among his students, particularly the ones studying exoteric religion. The Sufis, when they speak of mysticism, they speak of esoteric, not meaning exotic and weird, simply meaning inner, attunement to the inner world, which is where the divine resides for us from a Sufi point of view. In qalb, in the heart. So, was there another part of your question that I missed? Afghanistan.
Yes, I just want to know what was going on in Afghanistan at that period. What were the religious differences, and how much of Hindu thought, and was it a kind of melting pot of?
It was a crossroads. He would there, as a young man, before he processed it all, most likely have met Hindu merchants, travelers, and so on. And Balkh was the center of Buddhism in that region. The famous Bamyan Buddhist statues that were destroyed right nearby. This Buddhism, interestingly, was called Greco-Buddhism by the scholars. Greeks who settled there after Alexander converted to Buddhism, Mahayana-style Buddhism, like northern India. And they had been there, but they were driven out. Many, many invasions. So traces of them were there. They were not there when Rumi was living there. But their stories, fragments of sutras, yes. Yeah.
So was Sufism an attempt at reformation of Islam? And the second part is, what was the relationship between Islam and Sufism at that point? I know how they feel about it today, but 13th century.
Well, the golden age of Islam is also the golden age of Sufism. So while Europe was in the Dark Ages, 8th, 9th century, they weren't even in the Middle Ages yet, let alone the Renaissance. They weren't publishing books. All that stuff was hidden away in monasteries, right? Islam succeeded in having a golden age. They had books everywhere. They didn't have printing presses, but people were busily copying. Art, all the architecture and artistic accomplishments, also the work of the Sufis. And many artisans were Sufis. Many of them belonged to guilds, and the guilds affiliated with Sufism, many of them. And this goes right up all the way to the famous miniaturist painters in Persia, Turkey, and so on. As far as the Sufis were concerned, they were the heart of Islam. That's where everyone should try to get to. That it was a kind of self-realization in the divine. It was less oriented towards theology and more towards the experiential and how one lives one's life. Some scholars say in that by the time we reach Rumi's age, the 13th century, that's the big flowering of Sufism, that perhaps 40-45% of the Islamic world identified itself as Sufi in some way. Today, according to the Pew research, I think there's 200 million Muslims that identify with Sufism in some way, which leaves, I guess, more than 1 billion who don't consciously, although Indonesian Islam has a lot of Sufi influence, for example. There was some dissension. When you have a religion that's that organized, you will have people protesting that these people are doing things that don't have to do, they're not following the strictest the rules, or let's put it this way. Historically, it is true that the ulama, that means the scholar, there's not supposed to be a priesthood in Islam, but these scholars, did kind of fall into a position like that. And the ulama and the Sufis often were at loggerheads. There was one traditional theologian, Al-Ghazali, there's a street named after him in Jerusalem. I know Salman Rushdie has done a new novel making him kind of the opposite of the enlightened Muslims, like Ibn Rushd. But in fact, it's not exactly that way. He tried to make Islam a safe place for Sufism forever. So in his big work, Attack Upon Philosophy, he wasn't attacking all philosophy. He didn't like Aristotle. He liked Plato. He has a lot of material on Sufism, on the practices of the Sufis, on listening to music, which people in the ulama were beginning to say, no, We were never supposed to be listening to music. We were not supposed to be having pleasures like that. And in his work, there's a short version called The Alchemy of Happiness that he did, so more people could read it. He says, look, you can have music that serves religious and spiritual purposes, and that's great. It should be done just so. The Sufis do it, and let's do it. But if you play music that's just for pure enjoyment, that does no harm to anyone, unless something excessive happens. He was very careful with his language, as he had to be. His brother, Al-Ghazali, was Muhammad. His brother was Ahmed Ghazali. He became a Sufi master, completely oriented towards experiential work, practices, meditation. He was not a theologian, but he was very important. So you can see, this is kind of what was going on there. Another famous incident, Al-Hallaj, 10th century. He ran into trouble with certain members of the ulama. And I have to say, there were members of the ulama who did, like Al-Ghazali, feel an affinity with the Sufis. But Hallaj had a large following. He was looking a bit like Jesus. He was going around with huge crowds through the countryside, some say performing miracles. There are huge works about his life by Massignon, the great Middle Eastern scholar. And he made pronouncements like Bayezid Bastami. And at one point, the famous one is, Ana al-Haq, I am the truth. And there were already people worried about him, so he was crucified. And they got a normally enlightened sultan, very enlightened in terms of many religions. I think it was indeed Saladin. He wasn't in Jerusalem at the time to say, whatever you think needs to be done. And they did crucify him. Hallaj is one of the martyrs of Sufism. It is not a practice, however, that wants to focus on martyrdom. He truly was martyred. So there was this tension. Yeah.
Another way of getting at this gentleman's question is to ask, how did Rumi begin? Did he come from a traditional Islamic family, or was he just an amalgam of all of the different traditions that were passing along the Silk Road?
One has to be careful, we're in the midst of New Age, this and that, and I realize I'm in California today. No reflection on anyone here. Although you're Californians. He was a very, very good student of the Quran. He had the Quran memorized, he had the hadiths, thousands in his head. And as you go through Masnavi, if you want to be a student of Islam and read the Masnavi that way, you will find 4,000 lines from the Quran in those 6 books. In Persia, they call it the Quran in the Pahlavi tongue, in the Persian tongue. But it, of course, is more than that. His father was a very good Islamic theologian and jurist. But he was Sufi as well. So there's a place where these things overlap. They really believed that they were teaching the religion, but the best part of it, I guess. And even to this day, we have to distinguish. There's very progressive Sufi orders that seem to fit in well with the West and liberalism and so on. And there are traditional Sufis. But traditional is not the same as, let's say, reactionary. I can't think of a proper word to use. They just adhere to certain norms. They, they eat halal. They do the pilgrimage to Mecca if they can. So there's a wide array of Sufis. Did I get all of that? Okay.
Now, I was going to say that, of course, today Ruby has, there's so much fascination about Rumi, and there's probably a lot of relevance in today's times, to bring back Rumi's thoughts. But how did he survive across 800 years and did, historically? Was Rumi always, did he always be, was he always limelight for 800 years?
Shortly after his death, his works spread very, very widely. And they traversed the Islamic world in fragments or in books or in parts. And he was seen as one of the central figures of Sufism in his own century. When he died in the Seljuk, actually he died in the autumn. The Ottomans, it had switched hands. So Turkey, what we now call Turkey, was Ottoman by the time he died. And the entire population was in the streets, including religious minorities, Azeris, Jews, some Mazdians, Zoroastrians. They all filled the streets. It is recounted in a book by Aflaki, the name of which I forget, but there's a written account from shortly thereafter. So his importance spread very widely. In Sufism, there are two figures that have come from that period to the present day. From Spain, from the Spanish Sultanate, of Andalusia, which was a multi-religious, fairly enlightened kind of governance, came Ibn al-Arabi, who was a devoted Sufi from a young age, and his first two teachers in Sufism were women. And this was he started in the 12th century, his studies, and then he traveled all throughout the Middle East. He's called a theosopher, he's a philosopher. So there are studies. William Chittick has written two books, one called Sufism, the Path of Love, that's Rumi. Sufism, the Path of Wisdom, that's Ibn al-Arabi. And both of these figures became very important. I think Ibn al-Arabi more among the intellectual elite, the people who could read. Rumi's stories were told in chai houses along the Silk Route. And I had a friend who lived in Afghanistan, and she didn't know till she helped choreograph Rumi's Masnavi with me. There's a really bawdy joke about a man who's seen by his wife with a woman he's having an affair with from a pear tree. She's up in the pear tree. Let's see. Which way does it go? Yes, and she sees it. And he says, "Oh, you're suffering. You're way up high. That was nobody. You're suffering an illusion. You're up in the pear tree." And so then she comes down, and then she says, "I'm tired. You go up and pick some fruit." So he goes up in the pear tree. So then she brings her lover out, and they're in the grass there somewhere, and he yells, and he's obscenities, and he's really angry, the type of things a guy would yell, And she says, "Don't be silly. You're a fool. You're in the pear tree. It's an illusion. You're way up high." And of course, as always with Rumi, there isn't a typical moral to this story. But she heard this one, in a chai house in Afghanistan. Some guys were telling this story, the body or parts of it. So he reached everyone, songs.
Music and poetry, I think that stays with us.
Yes, and Ibn al-Arabi couldn't reach the people that way. But Rumi's, ghazals, they were constantly being made into songs. In India today, Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan had several major Rumi songs on his records, lyrics. So he very quickly became the center. There are other great figures. He's not alone. Sufism is not just one prophet or one revelation. What was the last? Say that last bit. It's everywhere. I recently directed some plays in the West Bank at Palestine, and they're kind of underground there, but I encountered the presence of Sufis there. The regions that they are best known for being present in is Morocco, where Sufi culture has a big impression. And there are two, not one, festivals in Morocco each year that are centered around Sufism. One is the International Music Festival, which is mostly Sufi music, but others as well, all comes together. And then the International Festival of Sufism in Morocco. In Kashmir, unfortunately, this was a very Sufi culture until, the recent 4 or 5 decades. And there was a Salman Rushdie novel where he showed another side of himself that was quite interesting. In The Moor's Last Sigh, I think that's the name of it, yes, he kind of mourns the passing of the union of the Pandit group, not Pandit in the sense of wise men, but the group of people that lived there, Hindu, and the Sufis, who worked together in cultural stuff. I think he has a traveling, am I getting the right novel? No, it's not Harun. I may not have the right novel, and I'm not here today to talk about him, but it is a story of a theater company which has existed through generations, through lineage. You know what I'm talking about? And it's huh? Yes. Okay. This is it. What he's writing about in the novel I'm talking about is all those years that the Pandit and Sufi performers work together on music and theater. And then they get driven out by the militancy, by the conflict, by the military occupations and all of that. But this sounds like a rebirth, which is kind of nice. So Kashmir, Morocco, Iran is full of Sufis. They just have to be careful. The thing is, in Iran, you must have 10 million households with Rumi's Masnavi on the bookshelf, whether they call themselves Sufis or not. He is the Shakespeare of their culture. There's nothing the authorities can do to remove Rumi, or Hafiz, for that matter, who's a century later. So I had studied for a while with a Persian master, Javad Nurbakhsh, who said, really, at essence, Persian culture, if you get past all the politics, is Sufism. Now, of course, for him, that included the previous Zoroastrianism. In one of his books, he said, welcome to the fire temple of Persian Sufism, showing the kinship they felt with what came before. Other regions. Western China the Uyghur region, has a large number of Sufis. Apparently, a friend of mine who lived in China pointed this out to me. There are entire cities which are mostly Sufis. So yes, there are distinct regions, to answer your question, where Sufis congregate, and it's become like a safe zone for their practices. Like that. Good question. How does one become a Sufi? So, I think before I came here on the plane, I thought it might be a good idea to just sit down and read Hazrat Inayat Khan again, a book one of many books by him I've already read. And he says, you know, there's something a little sloppy here in the West. People would like to have tea and be told, how can I do it? we can talk about it. He says, really, you know, it's like anything you do well, like any art. You can't be a great artist without working at it, without the discipline, without returning to it day in and day out. You can't even be a good certified public accountant, you know, without applying yourself to it. So to do it, yes, part of the process is reading a book that inspires you, let's say. Maybe part of the practice is learning simple meditation, breath meditation, which is so similar in, you know, the Indian traditions, the Hindu traditions, as it is in Sufism. Both in Buddhism, it's just the breath, at least basic meditation. But mantra meditation, for example, in Hinduism, in Sufism, a master may give you, they call it a zek. It means remembrance. It's usually an Arabic word, just like a mantra is a Sanskrit word. And you align that with the breath. This is something best done with a teacher who knows how to help you do that, how to align it, and maybe you can sit with them. Sometimes with this kind of teaching, it's not all intellectual, right? Just sitting with someone who is mindful of what you're doing and knows what you're doing helps you along. But they can also correct you. I mean, even breathing meditation, which we know mindfulness meditation is very popular now, and it's very useful for people. And it's very mild. It doesn't require struggle. But people on the path, whether it's Vedanta or Sufism, it's a challenge sometimes. I know a woman who, actually these things are not supposed to be recounted, but after, I'd say 10 years legally, we're entitled to put it in the public domain. But she was speaking to one of my Persian teachers, and he asked her the opening question. They ask very simple opening questions when you go to meet. What do you want? She said, I want to be at peace with myself. And there was a silence, and he looked at her, and then he started laughing. And then he laughed really, really loudly. And then he said, oh boy, you've come to the wrong place. They will sometimes try to scare people away who they think may not be committed. That wasn't true in this case. I think it was just a genuine, honest response to, I'd like to do something without effort. I'd like to be at peace. But it's a process of self-realization, to use that more modern term. And that requires work on oneself. So, as with Vedanta, as with the Upanishads, the small ego has to somehow give way to the bigger self, the Atman. And that can't just be done easily. So a teacher, a practice. When in doubt, one sits down and meditates. There are other practices that one can get on retreats, working with teachers. There's chanting. Sufis use movement. Sufis apply the practice of listening to music. But you can't just space out and listen to the music. It's something special. It's a form of meditation. So if one wants to go on the path, one shouldn't just bushwhack into the forest. Find the path, use the map. And you will do it your own way. There's a different path for every person. Yeah.
So from what I'm understanding from you, at one time Sufism and Islam was one.
Sufism, like with the Divan Mardi, arose from some traditions that predate Islam. And you'll hear some conservative, not radical, but conservative imams today say the Sufis say they predated Islam, and they're right. So if you're hanging out with the Sufis, you might be making a mistake. but it was given a home in Islam. And what is interesting historically, the mystics in Christianity did not do as well as the mystics in Islam. They got wiped out. The Dead Sea Scrolls, the Nag Hammadi scrolls that were discovered in Egypt, they have mystic Christianity, but the church wanted them gone as they became a big institution. But then came the Inquisition years later. I mean, there was almost no chance there. There are a few great Christian mystics, Teresa of Avila and her teacher, St. John of the Cross, Meister Eckhart in Germany. They were Christians. Clearly, they were Christians, but they were mystics. That's how the Sufis regarded themselves within Islam. But if you're a mystic, you cannot wall yourself off from other people, because that's where God is. Even today, Sufism can be looked upon as a form of Islam. In Inayat Khan's lineage, I have encountered a fair number of people that it became very liberalized and westernized in the 60s and 70s, and a lot of them don't want to hear that there's any connection with Islam. The current Pir of the order, Pir Zia Inayat Khan, has tried, without being dogmatic, to restore the idea that this is one of the best, one of the most useful Islamic traditions for spiritual seekers. And it makes use of Islamic terminology and phrases and so on. So it depends which Sufi you're talking to. But in most of the world, the Sufis consider themselves Muslims. Yeah. Oh, absolutely. It's just not what we're seeing on the news. It's very sincere, it's very heartfelt, and one needs to remember that when we talk about Islam. And for the Sufis, Islam doesn't mean submission, it means surrender. That word derived from the word peace, it means surrender. that means the opening up, again, of the ego to something higher. It doesn't mean I'm going to submit to worldly authorities, to religious authorities or political authorities. I'm going to follow blind orders. It has nothing to do with that. On the contrary, if you're submitting to this kind of open view of the world, you cannot follow orders blindly that will destroy other beings. So for most Sufis in the world not living in this country, they feel themselves to be part of Islam. But they also appreciate other religions.
There's an overlap of you're seeing Sufism as kind of meditation and breath.
That's a practice, yes.
And then coming to the Islam. Maybe I don't understand some of that. Is that similar to that? Meditation, breath, and
the meditation using breath, using zikr, which comes from the Quran, by the way. That's a word called remembrance, meaning remembrance from the Quran. So these techniques the Sufis feel they can find in the Quran because it speaks of practicing zikr, of being aware of always remembrance, always mindful of where we come from. And they tried to turn this into a methodology, some people say a science, of how can we be in a state of remembrance? How can we always be aware that we are divine, that this is divine, that the divine is within us, that God is present? They find that in the Quran. Let's face it, all the great religious texts have a wide variety of things in them. So if you go through the Old Testament, you're going to find a lot of war and destruction, and the infidels must be destroyed, the idolaters, whatever. Same thing in the Quran. We have the problematics of war in the Mahabharata, and it's not all peace, bliss, and tranquility, is it? I mean, it's again, come back to your question. It's a struggle. I mean, the Mahabharata puts a war at the center of the quest. How do you deal with that? So this is in the Quran, but for the Sufis, this is part of the struggle. They prefer, however, surahs like the light surah. Nur is the name of that surah. And it is, the surah says, this light is like unto a tree, an olive tree that is neither of east nor west, and the flame is fed by an oil that cannot be seen. And it is a flame in a glass, in a niche. So this part of the light surah, these are the ones that are most important to the Sufis, obviously. If you want to be a warrior fanatic, you will focus on episodes that came from the wars with the Quraysh tribe in Mecca. And it, like so many religious texts, it can be abused.
Did he go to do the 5 prayers and go to Mecca? Know that? Did he have a family?
We're talking about Rumi now? Yeah. Did Rumi go to Mecca? Did Rumi do the 5 prayers a day? I would say to him, doing the 5 prayers a day was considered a normal part of daily life, part of the religion. However, there is a tradition by one of his archivists where he was in Konya and they were doing the turn, the Sema exercise in the Tekiya, the Sufi center. And a guy leaned in the window and yelled, the prayers are being called. And he responded, we are praying. So there was always room for that which is most sincere, that which is most honest. So yes, we have these outlines of things we should do, but it's not always the best move just to do it blindly. There's another story about Bayazid Bestami in which he met, he met some pilgrims on the way to Mecca. But he had been roaming as a wandering dervish, and he was extremely hungry. And so the pilgrims had a lot of food. And he said, share your food with me, brothers, and I have my family, and and they said, well, no, we were going to Mecca. And he said, oh, I'm telling you, just circumambulate me, and you'll be there. He's one of these Sufis who could get in trouble periodically. So, yes, the rules are there, the patterns are there for a reason, but what is the most sincere thing to do at any given time? What is the best thing to do spiritually? This is the priority. It's kind of existential in that way.
Did he have a family or children?
He had a wife. He had children. One of his sons may have been implicated in the disappearance of Shamsi Tabriz, his spiritual beloved, his teacher. And he didn't seem to talk to him after that. No letters. Sultan Valad was his beloved son. Sultan Valad became the master of his order when he passed away. And he also, those whirling ceremonies you see now, with beautiful Turkish classical, very stately classical music. It's not so wild as some Sufi music can get in in Iran. But the music with the whirling in very distinct patterns in a very stately manner, where the Sema master walks between the whirling, the Semazans, the whirling dervishes, and with their wide skirts, they cannot touch him. They have to be aware of the inner and the outer at the same time. This wonderful ceremony his son actually put in place, not Rumi, just refining what his father was using. His wife, I've forgotten her name, I'm sorry to say, yes, she was with him most of his life. She died after him, I'm pretty sure. Yeah, so he had a family.
But he didn't write to her.
Yes, yes. He wrote to her. He wrote to his daughter. He had a daughter. He wrote to Sultan Balad, and he wrote to a bunch of. There are letters that exist. They're published separately. Yeah. In public, because of interpretations of Sharia in much of the Islamic world, only men did it, and only men played the musical instruments. However, I guess we had this whole discussion earlier. You cornered me, and we did. You don't even have to be here now. I discovered this myself in the Suleiman Tekiya in Galata. As you go up that big hill on the European side of Istanbul, there is this beautiful tekiya with an octagonal whirling sema place for the dervishes that Suleiman the Magnificent built for them. And they still do the ceremonies there. But I went to visit the masters of that group on the Asian shore, and there they had an old wooden tekiya, and I went inside, and the women were turning and playing musical instruments and so on. Buried beneath, not buried, but in shrines, these big coffins with turbans they have on them, was a woman, Sheikha, from 1700 for that order. So that's always been present with a certain amount of discretion. Women Sufis do take part in all the practices. In Iran right now, though, for example, in a Hanukkah, if they do sema, or they play the music, and people move, or they dance, or they simply move their heads and they do the zikr out loud, the women need to be in a separate room because there can always be a spy. Right? So there's a curtain. But the same order in Europe or in North America, no. Everyone, they sit in the classic Sufi circle together. They meditate together. They listen together. Because that's the ideal. You have to deal with realities. You know.
One last question. Can I ask a question about...
You already had all of your questions. You can, yeah, sure.
Between Rumi and Hafiz, so how much of a tradition of Rumi studied did Hafiz have? How much did he relate back to Rumi in his own writing, in his own work?
Well, Hafiz was of great stature. And Hafiz also was regarded as a master poet, believe it or not, more than Rumi. He's like Keats or Yeats, just a superb master of form. And he wrote a lot of his poems, and everything is worked out. Rumi just did them spontaneously, and people wrote them down. So Rumi is kind of, I would compare him to Walt Whitman, you know, just a sprawling, singing, you know, kind of poet. Hafiz is kind of like the great sonnet makers in the West. And he was great in that regard. I don't recall him ever mentioning Rumi specifically. I bet he does. But he owes to Rumi only the fact that the tradition was really growing, the poetics, the music, and teaching experientially through that kind of art. I think that's kind of the connection I see. She had said one more question, and we have to get permission. She's gone now. She's gone. You can ask it.
I just wondered if there was a biography that you would recommend, because I never thought of him as having a life. You know, it was always just, you know, the poetry. It's like he was the spirit. You know, he had a life.
It's very hard to get a real biography, but this book by Aflaki has Aflaki. Has various accounts from shortly after Rumi's death about his life. Some people are using it and weaving it into biographies now. There is a book of his discourses, once again, spontaneous, table talk. In Persian, it's called In It, What's In It. Sounds very Zen. It's translated as Table Talk or Signs of the Unseen, different translators, and it's him talking, and he refers to some things that are going on in the city at that time. But his letters, I think, may be the thing that reveal his life, personal life, most.
Okay, I've been waiting for a long time to ask a question.
Oh, that's why you said only one more question, because I'm next.
I'm next. So, in the play, you make one of the characters. In fact, Hazrat Inayat Khan says that all matter is made up of waves. And there is also the idea that each religion is associated with its own music, with its own sound. And I know this is a theme that you come back to often. Did you want to talk about it a little bit in terms of the connection of religion, sound, and music?
Yes, but I told her all about this before.
She's the only qualified one amongst us who knows how to ask the right questions.
I was in a corner, it was by the food or something. I tried. There is for artists and musicians, there's this marvelous book by Hazrat Inayat Khan, which is published by the biggest spiritual book publisher, Shambhala, called The Mysticism of Sound and Music.
Let me get this to you in your hand. We should have done this much earlier.
Feels like I should sing.
Yeah. Michael Jackson.
Right. So this work is quite remarkable in that he goes very closely into the matter of how sound, music, vibration affect us when we're talking, when we're playing music, the importance of the effect that music has on us. How does it have that effect on us? And in fact, he goes so far as to say, it's a long work, and I tried to condense it into the 2-page monologue in the play, that there really is no solid world. There is no such thing as a solid atom. He said basically, everything is or can be vibrations. When we look at things, we think of them as solid, but it's vibrations. So in a sense, everything is music. If we could only be attuned to that, we would be hearing that music everywhere. And he goes back to the medieval European idea of the music of the celestial spheres, the music of the spheres. He says this is what that idea is. So he was a musician, remember. He came with his vina and his ensemble, and they played all over Russia and Europe and North America. He was a musician first, and then his teacher said, it's more important for you to present Sufism. So he stopped touring his music. But he was a musician. His children all went to conservatory. So our refinement, our attunement through practice, through meditation, through relationships, is like listening to music, and everything is vibrations. The implications of this are pretty good at the beginning of the 20th century when you consider that that's particle physics. Something is sometimes, when you view it, it's a particle, sometimes it's a wave. You can't see it as both at the same time. All particles are potentially waves. That's a principle. It's Heisenberg uncertainty. I don't know if I should go there. It's not my area of expertise. So,
A lot of experts here in that area.
well then, we could open that subject up. This is also important to the story of Noor, who was a musician and did not choose conventional weapons. She chose to send signals over the airwaves. That's why the title of the play is Sound Waves. So that's why his speech, which is a 2-page version of a 300-page book, is in the play.
It's very dense. As the director of the play, I had to think very hard. Anyway, if anybody else wants to say anything, we are open to one last question. Doesn't know what to say.
So have you considered writing like a Sufism for dummies? Simple.
It exists.
Oh, it does. Okay.
It's that whole series.
Yeah.
That's Einstein for Dummies and so on. It's there. I'm pretty sure.
Joe didn't have to write it.
Besides the play itself, what would be recommended reading before we go see it, so that we can see it?
Oh, wow. Well, in terms of the second half of the play, a book came out. I was already working with her life and trying to figure out what to do, and then the book Spy Princess came out. And that is really an account of her leaving France, what was going on in France, and then going to England and signing up somehow to fight fascism in Europe. Her home countries now being England and France mostly. In terms of that, you'll find you'll find some passages from it. They're from the record in the play. You might want to read. There's a volume of Noor's stories. She was going to publish them before the Nazi invasion, and it's available in French and English edition. She wrote them, some in English and some in French. It's called Akbar's Daughter. And she deals with not just Eastern tales, but even French tales like Renard the Fox. She does her own versions of them. It's a nice, beautiful, lucid little book. Aside from that, depending on your interest, you might read something by Hazrat Inayat Khan, The Inner Life, or if you're a musician, The Mysticism of Sound and Music. It really depends on what your angle is and what your interest is.
So there were a lot of other people, and I just want to say this very quickly because I know we're running out of time, who wrote this. So this is this gentleman here plays JoeMartin, who's her spy handler in the play. And when he wants to get to know her better, he reads this book, which is a book of Buddhist tales that Noor Inayat Khan actually wrote. She was, and I would love for everybody to get one for their kids because it's beautifully written. She wrote it in French and English, right?
She wrote it in English.
She wrote it in
It's a little bit Victorian, but if you read it nicely to your children, they'll go for it.
It's beautiful English. It may be Victorian, but it's beautiful English.
Mm-hmm.
There are several books like that, of course, and the book does figure in the play.
It does. In fact, one of the stories is performed.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. I just wanted to say that I want to thank Kalpana for even conceiving the idea of bringing Joe here. We partner with Sachi on many things, and when I had asked Kalpana if she would help market the play, she said, of course, it sounds fascinating. And look at the playwright, he's more fascinating than the play.
Okay, so they don't have to go to the play now.
They absolutely have to go to the play. Now, yeah. So thank you to Sachi, and thank you to all of you for being here. We are going to end the formal Joe here and you there part of the afternoon. But Joe's books are there. There's food. There's still tea. The weather is still nice, and Joe's happy to autograph for you any book that you might want to pick up and be reading it to you. And just a big thank you from everyone at Enact on behalf of the actors who are preparing the play, and on behalf of Sachi, and a big thank you to Joe for rearranging several meetings and flying out in 3 days' notice.
That's a 3.
And a big thank you to all of you for being here and making this happen.
Anita, thank you for opening your beautiful home to us.
Yeah, I very much do appreciate this possibility of meeting people here who are involved in the show or maybe seeing the show. It makes it more real somehow to me, yes. I want to just say one caveat about the books. No, not a caveat, just a caution. There's, for example, a book of plays there. That is for people interested in theater. That may not, the collection has not that much to do with Sufism. It's from the first half of my career.
Revenue, Joe.
No, it is. I didn't say they aren't good plays.